My name is John T. Bobo. Today is September the 7th, 2016, and I'm in Shelbyville to interview Ray Fraley. This interview is taking place as part of the legal history program of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Ray, give us your full name, your date and place of birth.
In spite of dementia, it's Raymond W. Fraley, Jr., June 1st, 1942. What was the other question?
The place of birth.
Oh, I was born in Alexandria, Virginia.
Who were your paternal grandparents?
My paternal grandparents were Scott Seymour Fraley and Lida Nichols Fraley.
Were they also from Virginia?
No, they were from a little place called Smith Creek, West Virginia. Huntington, West Virginia.
And what about your maternal grandparents?
My grandmother was Sarah Willie Brinkley. She was a Bonner, and she married Eston Clyde Brinkley, and they were from North Carolina in the Wilmington area. My mother was born in Burgall before Sarah Willie left my grandfather and came to Virginia.
Well, if your grandparents were in West Virginia and North Carolina, how did your parents get together?
My dad, at an early age, I guess he was around 6 or so, moved with his dad and mother, and he was a bull calf, the only child, to Virginia, Northern Virginia. And my mother, when her mother separated from my maternal grandfather, they came to Northern Virginia. And that's where my dad and mother met.
And what were their names?
My dad was Senior, Raymond W. Fraley Sr. My mother was Charles Willeen Fraley.
And are either of your parents alive?
No, I lost my mother a couple months ago. Miss her every day.
And how old was she?
She was 91.
And was she still in Virginia at the time?
No, my dad retired at 42. And I'll never forget it. I was running, dodging danger out west somewhere, and he called me and said, "Do you want anything to do with this business that he had been involved in for a lot of years?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And so next thing I know, he retired and moved to Wilmington. Got a place on the water, beautiful, beautiful place in New Hanover County, North Carolina, my mother's home.
What did he do?
He was a brick contractor and developer in Northern Virginia, and when he came out of World War II, he was a combat engineer with Patton's Army, primarily in Czechoslovakia. When he came home, I remember in 1948, he told me a man with a pickup truck and a shovel could make a fortune. And that was in the days when housing boom was just going crazy, particularly in Northern Virginia and Maryland side. It was true.
If he retired at age 42, how old was he when he died?
He died in 1988, so he was born in 1920.
And during the time from his retirement to his death, what activities was he engaged in?
My dad was the original ADDDD guy. You know, he had more interest in. It was unbelievable. He had his own. He developed pictures in the old days when you go into a dark room and develop pictures. He made his own arrows. He was an archer. He was a great hunter, which was strange because I never could hunt. I just couldn't do it. I remember he took me hunting one time, and he said, "I'm going to cross the gully over here, and I'm going to scare up a squirrel, and here's your 20-gauge shotgun. You can shoot it." And I fired up in the air. He said, "Damn, you missed the squirrel from..." I said, "Yeah, I couldn't see it very well," but he hunted everywhere, and all over America, and yeah, he had more activities. He was a fine athlete in his day. The war took him away from the chance to go to Emory and Henry on a football scholarship, and he was a fine basketball player. I've got a great picture of him, the captain of the basketball team at Lee Jackson High School. And yeah.
During those years, did he influence your ultimate career decisions?
No. You know, it's funny about children growing up with parents, and we had a lot of laughter in my home. It was, in particular with my mother, who was outrageous, and always has been. She was a little, little Irish woman with crinkly blue eyes and red hair. Had me when she was 17 years old, so we kind of grew up together. But she was something else to be around in those days, and so we grew up with a lot of laughter and a lot of fun. My dad was a machine. I just marvel. And one of the reasons I didn't want to go into the business that was successful is because I couldn't compete with him. He was dynamite, and he was an artist. He could take a brick trowel and do circles, and I mean, he was so fast and incredible.
Did you have any siblings?
I have a sister, Sarah Jean. I tell everybody that my mother had one child, and my sister's a saint. I was her bull calf. I mean, I was a titty boy from the very beginning, and I called her. One of the great stories I tell folks, to mamas, and I'll digress to tell you, one of the things that children don't do enough of, I don't think, is to sit down sometimes with a parent or a grandparent and ask some philosophical questions about them. We tend not to do that. We're growing up, and I guess maybe a parent, if they're like I am, they might tend to a little hyperbole so as to make a point that, to a child that you want to get a message. But my dad's birthday is July the 31st. And I remember one year when my oldest baby boy, Will, who's a lawyer in Murfreesboro, he and I had some kind of spat, one of those you never remember. You can't remember one thing about it. And in a day or two, and then he went to his room to pout, and I was in my library and at the home pouting, and I looked at my watch. It was July 31st, my dad's birthday. So I wrote a little note, took it down to his room and stuck it under his door. And it says, "Today's my dad's birthday. I wish I could talk to him." And so over the years, I've tried to communicate with my children in a way that they can know a little bit about me. But the truth of the matter is, it's difficult because you want to be a parent. So what I'm doing today, for example, to me, is something, I'm kind of bleeding my soul here with you, because you and I have been together for a long, long time, JT, and we've shared a lot of heartache, and we've shared a lot of fun and laughter. And you've got three great babies, and I'm sorry to call them babies, they're all grown up. I hate it. And so that's one of my themes this year, and I always have a theme when I take a vacation with the family, is this year's theme was the joy of life, joie de vivre. And the sub-theme was that first one I just told you about my dad. And so when I'm growing up in Virginia with my mother, who is so young and so spirited, she didn't finish, she might have finished the 11th grade, but she was a reader, and my dad was a great reader, by the way, too. But I remember I was playing American Legion baseball somewhere up in Virginia, and I was a first baseman, and the first baseman on pickoff moves takes his glove and kind of tags the runner coming back to first, and I hit a guy beside the head, and he got mad and threw dirt in my face, and a fight broke out, and umpires were out there. Next thing I look over my shoulder, I'm on the ground, and my mother's scaling the fence. Here she comes. She flies out there and jumps right on top of that umpire and says, "Get your hands off my boy," or whatever it was, and the next thing I know, we're being booed as the two of us are escorted from the stadium. That was my mother. And she's never changed. And one of the last things she told me was, she said, "You can always remember this, wherever you are. My arms are wrapped tightly around you." And so when I came back from Vietnam, when my dad died in '88, I called her every day after that, every single day about the same time. And the reason, when I was in Vietnam, she wrote me every single day. Not a day went by that she didn't write me. Sometimes those letters wouldn't catch up with me for 2 or 3, 4, 5, 10 days. But they just weren't letters. They were describing the magnolias in bloom, the azaleas. She lived on the water at the low tide, the smell of the oyster bed, her favorite hummingbird, the Spanish moss. So when my dad died, I called her every single day, and if I happened to be a little late calling, I'd get this: "Raymond, have you forgotten your mother?" "No, Mom, I've got somebody here." "Well, let me speak to him." I'd have to put her on speaker to talk to my client. It was sometimes somewhat embarrassing, but nonetheless, you did what Mama said. So she always called me in the end, because when I was in college, she'd always say, "You need a little spending change?" I said, "I could use a little, Mama." So now whenever she calls me in those conversations, she said, "You make us any spending change today?" "Yeah, Mom, I made a little bit for us." "You need a little bit?" "No, Mom, I think I'm all right today." But she was a character.
Now, your mother just recently died, didn't she?
She died in January.
And how old was she?
91.
And of course, you miss her still.
Every day.
You have those letters?
Every one of them. I don't know how they got back from Vietnam, but they did, and she had them. In fact, one of the horrible things, maybe it's not horrible, but when you lose a parent, and that's the last one, you have to go clean out the house. And you don't know what they keep. My mother was a pack rat. Well, she had my essays from my college days. She had my Marine Corps tactic books, the letters. She had letters from my first wife, my first girlfriend. She had letters from my second wife. She kept them all. And they were, when I had this aortic valve replacement back in December, I had time to sit. And I would read some of that. And I said, well, I'd forgotten all about taking that course in philosophy or logic or something like that. And I thought, wow, she kept all that.
Well, let's jump back off this philosophy and logic and try grade school. Where did you go to school?
I went to a place called Mount Eagle in Northern Virginia, and from there to Groveton High School in Northern Virginia. It was a new high school then. And I had gone initially to Mount Vernon High School in my 8th grade year, and then the new school started, and I moved a little further up the road.
I've heard tales of your great athletic skills. Did you play sports in school?
I did. I played all of them. I played football, basketball, and baseball. And baseball and basketball were my two best. The only thing to save me in football, I had pretty good hands, but otherwise I wasn't. I played and lettered and all that, but I wasn't that good.
Any of those teachers or coaches influence you?
Yeah. In the 4th grade, I had a teacher named Miss Dovell, and she had this little thing where she liked students to stand up and tell a story. And I got my first feel of standing up and telling the story. My character was Beanbag. I can still remember that. And in the 7th grade, I wrote my first novel. It was absolutely horrible, but I had a fellow who's now a Catholic priest. He did my typing for me, and we had a good time writing this novel about somebody. It was a takeoff of one of those Tom Swift books. You remember you're probably too young to remember, JT, but
thank you.
Like the Hardy Boys and things like that. I was just plagiarizing like heck. But my greatest influence outside my dad and mother was Gus Pannegas.
And tell us who Gus Pannegas was.
Gus was my mentor, baseball coach specifically, and a basketball coach when I was on the JV team. He and my closest and oldest friend from those days of 60 years is a fellow named Bart Fry. You've known him and met him with me, and he and I grew up under the tutelage of Gus Pannegas. He was a former Marine DI, Greek, had calves, unbelievable big calves. We were just astounded. But he had these great sayings. He was and sarcastic as anything. And one time he kicked me in my shins, and I went home with this horrible bruise. My mother went out and said, "Coach, if you want to do this to my son, he's just not going to play." So he said, "Satch," that was my nickname, "come over here." "Yes, sir." "Get your bag and I'll see you." "What?" "Your mother says she doesn't like you." So anyway, I stayed, of course. But Gus, when I was a senior in high school, he gave me Baldwin's great book, Go Tell It on the Mountain. I was in a segregated school, and I didn't realize it. The times, this was 1957, 6, 8, 9. I didn't realize it because I worked with my dad in the summers, and we had in the labor gang, and I love all these characters that I dealt with. Willie Courtney. It was just amazing. And then we didn't have any football teams or anything in the grade school, so I played on an all-black football team. My dad would haul us around in a truck. And in these games, and it wasn't organized. It was just we tried to find somebody to play, And I had a great friend named Julio Betancourt who came to our school. In fact, I met him in Mount Eagle in my 2nd year. He was a Puerto Rican fella, and it was obvious he had some Negroid in him, But I didn't see it, quite frankly, and didn't recognize it. And it always amazed me as time went on, before I got a little bit involved in the civil rights movement later, that there was a big difference. I should have recognized when my dad would pick up the labor gang, the kind of homes they were living in. It wasn't anything like mine. We had a fine home, and my dad had built himself. I just never recognized the injustice at that time. The first time I got a feel for it was when I was in I want to say the 5th or 6th grade, because my mother kept a log of all the books I read that year. And I read a biography. These were kid biographies, if you can remember those. The first 9 chapters of 10 chapters were all about the young man growing up, and you don't know if it's true or not. But I remember one of them I read was George Washington Carver. And he had a section there about they didn't have much in the way of clothes, and how his brother took one of these burlap sack bag shirts and wore it so that it wouldn't be so rough on his little brother, when he got it. That struck me as important. And then the next one I read was Black Beauty and the inhumanity of treatment of animals. And so that was my first taste that I didn't know how to call it then, that I was going to be an absolute left-wing Democrat before it was over with, without knowing it. That my feelings were, I knew what I felt at an early age. So that's what went on in high school. Gus Pannegas, who I did his eulogy when he died in Culpeper, Virginia. And when I finished the eulogy, because I named my youngest baby son after him, Gus Barton Fraley, John Gus Barton Fraley, my oldest baby boy said, "Why did you name me Gus?" That's how important he was.
So I was going to ask you, you have preserved your mentor's name with your second son?
Yeah, yeah.
And I seem to recall a Gus story that had to do with the piano.
Gus Pannegas, not Gus. I was a pretty good baseball player. I led the league in the state of Virginia in hitting my senior year, and I was the MVP. I mean, I thought I was a hot shot. You always think that, by the way, until you get in college and realize, my God, I'm just one of millions. Geez. But Gus used to have a thing when I'd hit the ball and have to run maybe for a double or triple. He said, "Satch, I don't mind you carrying that piano, but don't stop and play it." I wasn't very fast, in other words. And Gus was absolutely. In fact, when I joined the Marine Corps, I drove to Culpeper to talk to him about it before I did. Told him I was kind of out of sorts and needed something to let me get my life together a little bit. I felt like sitting on the dock of the bay watching the tide roll away with the Otis Redding.
I want to go back to that Marine Corps in just a minute, but what's the significance of the name Satch?
Gus, my mother, look, when I went to grade school, she'd put me in knee socks and shorts with suspenders and a little bow tie. I wasn't embarrassed to start with, but as you can imagine, as time went on, when I get my pictures as a little boy, I'm in a Navy suit. That's the way she treated me. I mean, put me in little Lord Fauntleroy stuff, and so she'd always put things in a satchel for me, a little satch, and so Gus Pannegas named me Satchel. I remember one time the Washington Post, when I had a real good basketball game, said Ray Satch Fraley. The little left-hander with an amazing touch. I love that. I still have it.
Then you left from high school. Did you go immediately to college?
Yes. Well, first, when my senior year, I had a bad temper, I guess, and thought fighting was the only way to do it. So my grandfather took me down to the Marine Corps recruiter in Alexandria, Virginia. I'll never forget it.
Out of high school?
In my senior year. I was still in school, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And see, I came from a family that did not have college backgrounds. My grandfather had an 8th grade education. I consider him one of the smartest men I ever met in my life, and the sweetest man I ever met in my life. And my grandmother, Lida, she was tough as nails and didn't like my mother, so I got along with her great later, but not back then. She loved my sister better, more malleable, I guess. But so he takes me down to the Marine Corps recruiter, Sergeant Blanco, and I can still see that man. And he said, "Mr. Fraley, what's this young man doing here?" And he says, The judge, he was not telling the truth. The judge said the Reform School of Marine Corps, he's going to the Marines. Is that right, young man? I said, well, I'm thinking about college. He said, well, you can always go to OCS when you finish college. And I said, okay, maybe I'll think about it. So I got out of there real quick, and then my dad took me to interview with the Naval Academy. Ben Carnevale was the athletic director at the Naval Academy. He was a former basketball coach, this is 1960, at Carolina, University of North Carolina. There's only one Carolina, of course. Those guys down there, the Gamecocks, don't count. This is North Carolina, Blue Heaven, Chapel Hill, just so it's clear on the camera. So he took me over, my dad took me over to Annapolis, and I interviewed Ben Carnevale, and he said, son, it looks like your grades aren't too good. You look like you're a pretty good athlete. We could use you here. But I'm just going to have to tell you, you're not going to be able to get in the Naval Academy. You're going to have to go to prep school, either Bullis or Columbia in D.C., Washington, D.C. My dad said, he'll change his mind in a week. Do you have any other suggestions? He said, there's a school in High Point, North Carolina. The coach is Virgil Yao, somebody I've known for years. He's a wonderful coach at High Point College, now High Point University. He said, you might try there. So I ended up at High Point playing for Virgil Yao, not very much, by the way, but playing baseball for Chuck Hartman, who later became one of the better college baseball coaches in America at Virginia Tech. Virgil Yao, by the way, has an interesting story. His cousins, they were from Gibbonville, North Carolina, but his two cousins, one is Kay Yao, one is Susan Yao, both affiliated with the University of North Carolina State University and a Hall of Fame coach, and then Debbie Yao, all were athletic women who have shown in basketball. And Virgil, in 1941, I don't think this has ever happened before, because of the war, beginning cracking it up, played on his basketball team, a female on the men's basketball, college basketball team. And as you know, back in the 40s, you had teams like Washington Lee beating big time teams. You know, Alabama would play schools like Hampton-Sydney. I mean, it was amazing in those days. And I remember Cumberland lost to Georgia Tech. You might remember that score, like 70-0 or something.
222.
222, yeah. I'm off by about 200 points. So anyway, I played there 2 years, and I got in a little trouble. And you know that old song, Blues Ain't Nothing But a Woman on My Mind? Well, anyway, one of my best buddies there, though, who came from West Virginia, whose daddy was a Methodist minister, was Olin G. Haynes, Gunther Haynes to me. And he and I met the first time in the cafeteria area, and in walked this good-looking girl.
Now, let me stop you with the good-looking girl right there. Let's elaborate on Olin Haynes. I think some of us know who he is.
Yeah.
But for the record.
Oh, I see what you mean. Olin is one of the superior lawyers in this state. He's in Johnson City, Tennessee. He now practices with his son, Olin Jr., which has kept him going as a result of that. He went to University of Tennessee Law School and roomed with Jerry Summers, by the way. But we first met as basketball players in High Point, and we're sitting there in the cafeteria. I'll never forget. And in walks this good-looking girl we later learned was Diane Westmoreland from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And for the next 2 years, we vied for her company back and forth. And Olin always says that I won because he married her and they ended up divorcing some years later, but had 3 beautiful children. But Olin and I left High Point about the same time, and he went to work at a bus factory as a welder. In fact, that welding job helped him on one of his first big cases in Johnson City. It had to do with a spot weld that was defective, and won a nice big judgment on that. So Olin left, I took off. I ended up going out west. And I was picking peas in Walla Walla, Washington. Worked for the Jolly Green Giant and Libby McNeil. Drove from there down to Berkeley, and I worked in a pizza joint down there. The guy that owned it, I can't remember his name, but he was a B-rate Western actor who owned this restaurant, pizza joint. I was there, I think it was 1960, when Marilyn Monroe died. Never forget it. I was sitting in one of those coffee houses. Back then, they were beatniks, and Jack Kerouac was my hero then, on the road. And I was everywhere. I remember I had an old pink, they call me a communist because I had a pink, that wasn't a Ford, but it was a Maverick, like a Maverick, I can't remember what it was, but a Mercury, pink. And I got to the Yellowstone National Park with about 20 bucks in my pocket and going through, and car broke down. So I met these two girls from Chicago. They were in front of me. And I honked at them and said, hey, car's out of touch here. Can you help me? And anyway, we hooked that car up, and they drove me all the way over to Berkeley. And we had a big time. The Cook sisters, I still have their address in my book. This is 50 years ago. The Cook sisters. I wonder what happened to them. I miss them today. And they dumped me off. I went to work there. And then I ended up in Yazoo, Mississippi at a lawnmower shop, you know, the great Yazoo lawnmowers. And that's when I learned about Willie Morris. Willie Morris, I didn't read the book until later, wrote a book called The Courting of Marcus Dupree. It was a story about one of the great athletes of the times, but Philadelphia, Mississippi, Neshoba County, is where those 3 civil rights workers were killed. Willie Morris graduated from the University of Texas after he left Yazoo, Mississippi, and went to New York and became the youngest editor at Harper's. And his first book he wrote was called North Toward Home, beautiful memoir. And then his next one, maybe not his next one, but the one that meant so much to me was the Courting of Marcus Dupree. It was a story about redemption. It had to do with, Marcus Dupree was the first integrated class, his class, from the first grade all the way through high school. And he captivated that town with his athletic skills. I mean, it was incredible what he did. And he was, his talents were vied for by every college in America, particularly Oklahoma, who finally got him. He later got hurt. They've done some great stuff with him on documentaries on what happened, but he unified that town. I've done some triathlons down there in Neshoba County where the end of the race is around the big lake. And where those 3 civil rights workers were killed and later found. One of the tragedies of the American South, something I'll talk to you a little later about when I tell you about Scottsboro when we talk about that. But that meant a lot to me when I learned about Willie Morris. He became somebody that I wanted to read. And he was a great friend of Truman Capote. He's since deceased, both of them. But then I ended up in New Orleans, and I was going to try to write the great American novel, and that's when I realized how deficient I was in grammar.
Are you midway through college? You
no,
out of college? You in law
I've
school?
finished 2 years, and I've taken off. So anyway, when I was picking peas in Walla Walla, Washington, later, I remember, and I can't remember what river it was, but it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I got this epiphany, I guess you might call it, about, you know, Fraley, you're just floating away here. What are you going to do? So I called my mother. I said, Mama, get me in. They had retired and moved to Wilmington. I said, get me in school somewhere. And so she did. She got me in Wilmington College in North Carolina, down on the coast.
How long was this period of floating?
Two summers, basically 2 years.
So she got you back in school?
Yeah, I said they retired and moved. She hadn't moved yet, but they were going to move within 3 or 4 or 5 months when I called her. So she got me, and I went to Wilmington, and my great aunt Jessie Todd, 6 feet tall, one of my great memories and great person in the whole world. Jessie Todd, my grandmother's sister. My grandmother had long been dead. So I moved in with her, and I decided I was going to isolate myself for 6 months. Now that's tough for a guy like me with my attitude and personality, I guess. But so I decided I was going to isolate myself for 6 months before I got into the social crowd and so forth. And I signed up for all the classes, and I had a wonderful literature teacher by the name of Dr. Corbett. And she came from South Carolina, but she had a PhD, and she married money. So you wouldn't think, you know, why would she care? But she was brilliant, and she introduced me to Russian novels. So I spent reading, I read Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, but what I was really doing, reading all these various novels, she had 4 walls in my bedroom in this house. And I wrote words. I was so deficient. I wrote words and plastered them on the walls, all 4 walls. And she didn't care. And so I later, by the way, took a course out of the University of South Carolina. I hate to say that, but I did, on words. They give you 20 words a day. It's actually a class, which helped too. Because I wanted to write. I had a feeling I wanted to write. I wasn't thinking about law school or anything like that. I thought I might want to write. So anyway, after 4 or 5 months of somewhat isolated, I did get out. You know, you can't miss that beer drinking around the colleges, and met some great folks. And then from there, I met the best-looking girl in a bikini I ever saw in my life on Wrightsville Beach, and her name was Diane Dawson, and she was a Merit Scholar. And I wrote a short story called Return to Ithaca later in life, because she forgave me for all my transgressions. But we married, and I was in Chapel Hill now, where she was a Merit Scholar. And when I got out of school, took my last exams up there, physical geography, made a D. I was selling insurance for American Defender.
Were you married then?
I was married. Nikki had come along, my first baby girl. Courtney, I named her after a catcher for the Washington Senators. Her middle name was Nichols, after my grandmother. And she was a blue-eyed, pretty little thing. And so, yeah, she was in Chapel Hill with me, and every day that Diane would go to class, Nikki and I would be together, and, you know, watching Andy Griffin on TV or something. And I would make phone calls. And if I could get 10 appointments to sell insurance, it was a deferred program where you meet with somebody and students. It was sold to student deferment, you know. But I'd make a nice commission. I made $3,000 my first month in the business, and I thought, whoa, this is 1966. But it didn't take me long to realize, my Lord. So I'm home. I went home one summer day, spring day actually, in North Carolina, to my mother in Wilmington, and sat on the pier, her pier, and I was sitting out there just kind of, you know, wondering what in the world you're going to do with your life. I didn't like selling insurance. Success didn't mean a thing if you don't have a love for it. So I'm watching the tide roll out, and I'm thinking of that old Otis Redding, you know, again, sitting on the dock of the bay watching the tide roll away. Metaphorically, it was my life floating out there. So I went back to Chapel Hill, and one Thursday afternoon, I left the Zate House, Zeta Xi, and drove to Raleigh, North Carolina, and joined the United States Marine Corps. Came home that afternoon, that night, and we were supposed to play bridge with a great friend of mine. So I walked in, Diane said, why are you late? I said, well, I had something to do in Raleigh. She said, Raleigh, what did you do? I said, I joined the Marine Corps. What? You know. And so the next thing I know, I'm in Quantico, Virginia.
Still married?
Still married.
Then how long did you stay in the Marines?
I got a total of 12 years in. I served 3 years and so many months, and then when I got out, went to law school, I stayed in the reserves out of Birmingham and later Nashville, get 12 years in.
After Quantico, what about your Marine career?
Well, Quantico, you have the OCS program. And
tell us what the OCS program is.
Excuse me, you're right. I'm sorry. Officer Candidate School. There's two ways. The only training center for officers in the Marine Corps is Quantico. You can go one of two ways. I guess you can go three if you, but one is to go to OCS, Officer Candidate School. Another is while you're in college, you can go during the summers. I think it's a 4-week, 5-week program called the PLC, Platoon Leadership Course. I didn't know about that then, those days, but it was one you weren't obligated. If you signed to go to OCS, you were obligated. Even if you flunk out, you're going to be a grunt, a enlisted man.
Did you flunk out?
No, I made it through, thanks to a little guy named Alan Herman, who came out of Chicago, Illinois. Alan was about 5'6", it seems like, with glasses thicker than Coke bottles, and the most squared away Marine I've ever known in my life. But he wasn't physically able to do some of the things that I was able to do. But he would say, Fraley, you're going to get us in more trouble with all your hammocks and so forth and so on. And he helped me with my brass and all. He was spit shined. And I mean, he was just the most wonderful little fellow. First time when the DI comes in to get you out of bed, the rack, excuse me, now, you got to talk in the Marine vernacular. The wall is a bulkhead, the floor is a deck, the bathroom's a head, your hat's a cover. You know, you got to learn to talk. So we're thrown out of the rack, and the DI comes in, drill instructor comes in, and I look over to my left, and there's this little pudgy guy with glasses on. I thought, what donut truck did he fall off of? And it was Alan Herman. I did a documentary later, John T. I think you've seen it, a little bit of it, and I think about him all the time. He wanted to be a leader of Marines, and he went to Vietnam. He was killed within 6 weeks.
When was this? What year was this?
This was 1966 when I joined, so this is into 66, 67. And then my class, most of us were in Vietnam in 68, 69, and that's why we had the largest casualties of any basic school class of any. Basic school is where you go after OCS. If you make it through OCS, you go to basic school to be trained, infantry trained, and no matter what your MOS is going to be, you're going to be trained.
When you were sitting on the dock of the bay, was the Vietnam War going on?
It was.
Did you know when you joined the Marines you'd end up there?
I did. Well, the funny thing about it, the recruiter told me, I asked him about Vietnam and so forth. He said, look, all it's like is instead of carrying a briefcase to work, you're going to carry a rifle. That's what he told me. I bought into it. But before I left, I read Bernard Fall's great piece of work called The Street Without Joy. So I learned all about Vietnam and the French and the trouble they had, Dien Bien Phu, and how they'd been run out. So I knew this war was, this stuff about we're fighting over there to keep us from having to fight in San Francisco. I knew that was a joke. But the truth of the matter is, I'd like to think I did it as a matter of patriotism, but there were two reasons. I joined the Marine Corps for two reasons. One, I was running a little bit, trying to find something that was honorable. But two, this was in the days of the protests were going on pretty good. The students were going on pretty strong. And I had at Chapel Hill, for example, and I need to go back and tell you something that occurred, but I thought, if I'm going to protest, I need to know a little more about what's going on over there. So who am I to scream and holler? And so when you have something happens like Kaepernick, this quarterback for San Francisco, that didn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
You're talking about the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. People are outstanding, are just astounded and mad about it. Many are. But I thought to myself, you know, that's one of the reasons we go over there, to give folks like him the right. That's what makes America different, where it's not real politic like it was in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, where if you didn't like it, you get hanged or burned at the stake or whatever. So I thought, you know, the Marines hate Jane Fonda, for example. But I'm thinking again, maybe that's why we go there, to preserve that right for somebody to protest. So anyway, I want to digress and tell you something that was important to me in my, I guess, coming to grips with injustice, I guess, and maybe what led me later to be a lawyer. When I switched schools, I was ineligible to play baseball because when you transfer, you have to wait out a year. So that summer, I met a fellow in the construction gang, and I was working, called James Bo Peep Bowman. What a character. He says, Fraley, you ought to play baseball with us. We got a league over here. I know you're a baseball player. I said, what's it called? He told me what it was. And I said, how many teams in the league? He said, 8. Really? Good league. He said, yeah. So he didn't tell me it was all black. I was the only white guy in the league. And so this whole summer, my buddies would come out and drink white liquor with the fans. But the women, they weren't called African Americans then. They were called black or Negro, but they were great. They'd come out dressed in their Sunday finest, and I was a pitcher and a first baseman. And wow, what a summer with Bo Peep Bowman. One time he caught me barefooted, and I said, where's your shoes? He said, I got bunions. They're killing me. And that's the kind of league it was. And the great story about this is this. I learned something about folks who could still laugh. And Wilmington back in the early 60s was a hotbed of racism. had some horrible situations there, killings and so forth. But 20-some years later, Bo called me and said, hey, can you get back to when we're having a little bit of a reunion? I said, really? With the league? He said, yeah. He said, you remember that All-Star game? I said, yeah. I made the All-Star team that year. We played in Legion Stadium in front of 3,000 fans. The only 2 white fans were my dad and his buddy Carl Staten from Northern Virginia. And the announcement went something like this. From Navassa, Muscles McCoy. From Browntown, Booker T. Armstrong. And from Wrightsville, Mason Burrow, Raymond for Fraley. I go out there, and I got the MVP for pitching 3 innings that game. But 20 years later, I get a call. So I flew up to Wilmington. We met at a restaurant. And I remember I didn't have any misgivings at all. I hadn't seen Jim Bragg, who was a fine pitcher and my nemesis, and he played for Browntown. And he was a tremendous athlete. One time he hit a baseball off me that went so far it looked like a little pea going out of the stadium. And so I walked in with no misgivings, but just hoping that things had gone well for all of them. You know, you lose track. You don't keep up. So I walked in. There's Bo. I knew Bo. I'd seen him over the years when I come home to see my mother. And there was Jim, Muscles, 2 or 3 others. They were all stevedores on the port, making about $28 an hour. That was great. But more importantly, every single one of them had children that had graduated from college. Whoa. That's what struck me as important. I said, Bo, you didn't tell me. So I wanted to meet the guys. And so that was that story and about those days. Then I went on to play baseball at Wilmington, and I wanted to play at Carolina, but my eligibility was up. As my dad said, you're going to draw Social Security before you're out of school. And
let me digress a little bit further back.
Sure.
You come in one night and announced to your wife and your baby daughter, who was probably 3 at the time.
Oh, no, she wasn't. She was an infant.
And say, I'm going to the Marines. What'd your wife and what'd your parents think about that decision?
All right, let me talk about my mother first. My mother, at the time, I was just 22, so that made her 36 or so. I can tell you when I flew out of Wilmington for the first time in my Marine Corps uniform, heading for California to then go to Okinawa and then on to Vietnam, I remember looking at her with tears in her eyes, strong as she could be. And when I came back, she had aged. So she never told me, I don't want you to go. She knew, my mother of all people knew me probably better than any. She would come into my room at night and I'd be playing Nina Simone and she had my favorite song was Trouble in Mind. I'm blue, but I won't be blue always, because that sun gonna shine on my back door someday. And so she knew I was struggling with what to do, and that I probably shouldn't have gotten married that young, and not that my wife wouldn't, I mean, she was something else. And I'll digress to tell you real quick, years later, she wrote me the kindest letter. And we've remained friends over the years. She remarried in Atlanta, Georgia. And she wrote me the kindest letter. She said, you've done everything you promised. You're an honorable man. Whew. Because it wasn't her fault that I was running. But one of the cute stories is that when I'd come back from Vietnam and got in law school and we divorced, she and Nikki lived in Atlanta. And she met a man that one of my great friends introduced her to, who was a builder over there, and a successful builder. And one day, Diane called me. She said, Raymond, I'm afraid I'm going to have to send Nikki to you a little bit for a while. I said, why? She said, she's going to break up my marriage. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, we were on the interstate, and she said something smart to Carl. And Carl said, I might just have to tan your hide. And I said, well, I don't want that. She said, well, Nikki turned to him and said, if you touch me, my daddy will come over here and break your face. Well, that's an old Marine Corps thing I used to say. So next thing I know, I go to a wedding in Charlottesville, Virginia. My parents picked up Nikki, and I had her from the 7th grade on. It was one of the great experiences of all time. And shared her with her mother, of course, but having that child in my life was more important. I would take her everywhere. One of the great stories, legal stories, is that after I'd been practicing law a long time, not a long time, but Martin Sir was with me at that time. I don't know if you remember Martin. Martin was, his dad was one of my great friends. We shared the same birthday, and he was a great union organizer and had a great business in Fayetteville, Tennessee.
And Martin is a lawyer in Nashville.
Martin in Nashville. And he's very big in his synagogue. He's, I mean, I want to call him a Jewish scholar. Matter of fact, I sent him a book not too long ago. Barry might laugh at that, Barry Bernstein, who got us together here today. But Martin had a daughter that graduated from University of North Carolina, too, I might add. But in any event, Martin was with me at that time a little bit. And so I get a call late at night about, I'd had a big case, and it was all over the countryside, and I'll share that with you later. But I got a call that said, I got a case for you, this woman, and she's kind of out of sorts, and she kept telling me, and I said, well, so finally she hired me, sent me money for an airplane ticket and to go to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Well, I took Nikki with me. I said, come on, we'll go, and they got a museum there, Will Rogers Museum, and we'll then go to Texas and watch the Texas Rangers play baseball.
How old is Nikki?
Nikki is there, she's about 12. So we jump on an airplane and we fly into Oklahoma City. I love Oklahoma City, by the way. It's an interesting town. It's more sophisticated than you might think, artistically speaking. But anyway, I rented a car, and I said, I don't know where this address is. We have to find it. So somebody told me where to find it. So we drive up into this shabby motel-looking place. It's one of those old motor courts. It's not even a motel like it. And I drive up and park in front of the number 10 that said was hers, that you could go in from the outside there. And I pull up beside a car, and I look over the car, and in the back seat of this car are hundreds and hundreds of packages and cartons of empty cigarettes. Whoa. So I knock on the door, and here comes this woman who is absolutely disheveled, got nicotine stains on both hands. She gets in the front seat of my car. This is my client now that's paid my way to come on this case. And she looks back in the back to Nikki. And she said, who's that? I said, that's my daughter. She said, no. She said, who are you? She said, I'm a little girl. She said, no, you're not a little girl. You're dressed up like an adult, aren't you? You're an adult dressed up like a little girl. No, ma'am, I'm really I said, uh-oh. So I drove Nikki and this woman to the museum, Will Rogers, and I found a 70-year-old security guard there, and I said, look, I gave him $50. I said, would you mind showing my daughter the museum? So I went to this luncheon room at the museum and realized this poor woman was absolutely out of sorts. But I tried to pacify her a little bit, say, yeah, I think, maybe the Queen Elizabeth did do that to you, whatever it was she had. She had more complaints. So we flew back, we went to Texas, and then we flew home. And for weeks after, I'm getting this call from this woman. She keeps calling and calling. In the middle of the night, Debbie, my wife now, would answer the phone and say, it's her again. So finally, I answered the phone. Hello? Look, and she would start explaining this case. And I said, look, Mr. Fraley died, but I want to give you the number of Martin Sir. He's one of the finest lawyers in America. Who? Martin Sir. And I gave him Martin Sir's number. And Martin, I don't think ever knew that I would have put on. But poor old Martin, I sent him to the jail one time to see a client, and he came back, and the guy he must have thought he was a serial killer because Martin left for Nashville shortly after that. Said he couldn't take the pace.
All right, well now I've got the rendition of your mother and your Marine session. What about your father and your wife?
My dad told me, he said, now look, I don't want you to go over there half-cocked and think you're going to be some kind of hero. He said, Pop, I'm going to come back the most decorated Marine in the history of the Marine Corps, who was Chesty Puller, by the way. And he said, yeah. So the story goes here. Now, he was stoic about it. I mean, he was kind of proud of me because he knew I was struggling too. I'll never forget it. Landing in Da Nang, the first thing that struck me were the coffins, stacked coffins. I don't know where my order's going to send me. I could check in. There 2 days being processed, and then I'm going to be sent to a place called Chulai. Don't know anything about it, don't know what it's like. So I'm at the air freight in Da Nang, waiting for this C-130 to take me to Chulai, and there was a rocket attack. Man, I jumped in the hole like it looked like a swan diver. Bam! Into the hole I went. And there, jumping in with me, was a girl named Marlene Hoar, H-A-A-R. I quickly changed her name later on to Marlene. Molly Bruce is what I changed it to, something else. But anyway, that was my. I'm going to be
Was
the most
she a
decorated
Marine?
No, she was a singer, Australian singer with a band. And so I acted like I said, oh, I can. Where are you going? She was going to Chulai with her band. So when I got there, I got her a 6x. And you know what she entertained that night? Roger Staubach was I call him a stevedore. He was unloading ships. The Navy was trying to protect him, I guess, out of harm's way. And they were unloading ships in the harbor there in Chulai. So
your daddy said, don't be a hero. What did your wife say?
not a lot. She just still had a hard time believing I'd joined the Marine Corps, I guess. But she knew I was unhappy selling insurance. And she was in her last year, finishing up as a merit scholar. I remember what impressed me one time. And like I said, I wrote a short story about it one time. It's called Return to Ithaca. I remember when I used to go to see her when she was still in school at Women's College in Greensboro. See, women couldn't go to Carolina to start with in the first 2 years. They could only go the last 2. And she would read parts of Ulysses to me from James Joyce. And probably never understood James Joyce like I should, but she was something else. And anyway, when I came back home, I didn't get in law school right away. I'd struggled to get in law school. Finally, I was in a basketball tournament in Birmingham, Alabama. I'd been picked up by a team in North Carolina. We won North Carolina, South Carolina, and then we ended up in Birmingham in the Southeast Regionals. Got beat by 40 points.
All right, before I get you in law school, let's go back to Vietnam. What was your duty station? What did you do? Were you infantry?
I had a platoon called, it was a civic, it's a strange thing. They were going to stick me with a communications, which I had awful. So there was no spot for me really, so they gave me a platoon, we would call it a group guard, the MAG-12 airline, the A4s, A6s, and the Phantoms were there in Da Nang.
Now, what's A4, A6?
They're fighter planes.
Okay.
And that's where I met my best buddy down over there, Laird Jackson. But, so I was unhappy, and they gave me a platoon, and it was a civic action group that was perfect for me. I loved this job. And what we did with this, and the platoon was made up of youngsters, young Marines that came from all over North Vietnam And they gave me a Vietnamese interpreter whose name was P.T. Kong. He was an architect by trade. And so our job was we would go out into the sticks, the boonies. They would fly us out in a helicopter, and we would be dropped, and then usually we walk back through, be out there 3 or 4 days in these various villages. And one of the things I got in Vietnam was the Vietnam government gave me an award that I got a picture of me getting that award. It's more for civic duty than killing. And I like that. We built a school. I met some Buddhist monks that were the biggest crooks you ever meet in your life, just typical of that. Anyway, so that was something I really, really enjoyed doing with that group. And with PT, by the way, Marines never got to go south to Da Nang, but we had a young Vietnamese youngster that was blinded in a rocket attack. So PT and I flew him to Da Nang, Saigon, where I spent 1 week in Saigon staying with his foster grandmother, who was Chinese, in the Chinese sector. And it was a great experience to spend. I went home with him to his home, and it partially bombed out. And I remember a big rat during dinner went right up the wall. I'll never forget that. But PT, they took it as natural.
Well, you couldn't shoot a squirrel with a 20 gauge. Could you have shot a man if they'd been after PT?
Yes.
Did you have rifles at your disposal?
Yeah, well, I carried a rifle and a pistol and grenades.
And you were a lieutenant?
Lieutenant. Yeah. Yeah, Vietnam was something that I wouldn't want my boys to have to, because I thought the war was wrong in the end, without question.
President Obama was in Laos yesterday for a meeting. What does that tell you about the world changing?
I don't know, to tell you the truth, because I don't think it's changed. I think it's still rapacious. I don't know.
Does that mean you think that was a wasted war?
Oh yeah, yeah. When they stopped us from winning the war,
they being
the politicians, we couldn't go into Cambodia. We couldn't go north with the fighter pilots. The bombing and so forth. Now is bombing right? But if you're out there to win a war, but after it's all said and done, when you get home and you realize what was the reason for that war? Who were we kidding? Vietnam, we should have maybe supported Hanoi and with the South, unified Vietnam. They were communists, but not the kind of communists we should have been afraid of, in my opinion.
Okay, you have told me over the years about your various conquests in the legal profession, but before we get you practicing law, tell me about your children, and specifically, would any of those be lawyers today, and did you encourage them to do so?
Well, my oldest baby girl is a lawyer in Birmingham who does not practice.
And that's Nikki?
She went to Sweetbriar and then to Carolina and then back to Sweetbriar. When she got out of school, she was working in Atlanta, and she called me and said she thinking about law school. I don't think her heart was really in it, but here's what I liked about it, their idea. I always want my daughters to be independent. And so I was glad that she had considered it, and she ended up going to Cumberland Law School because it would give her independence. She wouldn't have to depend on a man maybe if something didn't work out. That was my theory with her. And she practiced a while, married, and two of my grandchildren. And she's 50 years old now, and she looks like she's 30.
But she is a lawyer by trade, but doesn't practice.
She'll call me on the phone and say, "Pop, I did 3 today." I said, "Darling, if you can't lace them up, if you can't do 5, don't lace them up."
And when you're talking about her running.
Running, yeah. I got all my children thinking about it. And then the Will was my college baseball player who had a chance to go to Virginia, and much to my dismay at that time, he ended up going to Middle Tennessee because of a girl. But I got 4 years to watch him play baseball, and the coach nicknamed me Mr. May. In college, the season winds down in May before you go to the College World Series. And his team, that he was the MVP and they got him into the College World Series, was one of the great thrills for a dad to have. And he didn't go to law school right away. I don't know what he was working at a bank maybe, and heck, he worked in, not Shoney's, but one of those Chili's or something like that. But I could see he wasn't thrilled about it either, so he ended up going to the Nashville School of Law, and he clerked for a judge in Murfreesboro. It's really great for him, and he's real popular up there. He's got one of those personalities that people like. And
so he is a practicing lawyer in Murfreesboro.
He's like your boys. I mean, you got those two great boys that practice law that everybody just loves because they're such gentlemen, and I hate to say it, they're sweet boys. They got sweet natures. But
what about son Gus? Is he a lawyer?
Gus, he makes me put on my office his diploma from the University of North Carolina. He says I'm the only one that really, all the way. All of them had a connection with Chapel Hill except Will. But when he was in college at Carolina, he coached 3 years at the high school as an assistant. Had a great coach there. Worked for Roy Williams. He wanted to be a college basketball coach. That was his passion. Now, he was a better baseball player. That was his sport. But he loved basketball. So when he got out, he got his first job at Tennessee State University, coached up there, and then got an offer to go to Tennessee Tech, and he's been there, I think this is his 3rd year. He got a great coach up there that he just really likes. He's had chances to go other places, but has elected to stay there for a while. And then my youngest baby girl, Carolina Fraley. Now, I named her Carolina later when she said she wanted to be called Carolina. Her name is Hannah. Everybody calls her that but me. She is in law school right now in Vanderbilt, her 3rd year. But the great story about her is that she was a great dancer. The Fraleys are good dancers, by the way. My mother and dad were jitterbugs, and we have a dance in the southeast North Carolina called the shag, not to be confused with some of the English terms. which means I'm in the backseat of my '49 Ford maybe, but no, this is dancing. And, but she was a good dancer and a good athlete.
But she's in law school.
She's in law school, but the story is when she was getting ready to go to school, she took the ACT, and so when she got her scores back, they were off the charts. So I called her two brothers. I said, "You two dumbasses couldn't add your scores up and get hers, and you made fun of her all those years." And she's sort of the hero now. And she's going to work in New York next year. She's already been offered a job in New York. I didn't even get an offer for anything.
And she's working in New York as a lawyer since she graduates Vanderbilt.
Yeah, she worked there this summer for Skadden, or the biggest, third best law firm in America. They flew her twice, first class, to New York, wined and dined her, first class hotels. I don't know what and they're going to pay her $188,000 a year.
Daddy's got to be proud.
I wonder what that apartment's going to cost me.
Now would be a great time to take a break before we get into your illustrious law career.
Well, I don't want to.
Ray, how long were you in Vietnam total?
A little over 13 months.
And did you consider re-upping at the time?
I did.
Why did you not do that?
I don't know the answer to that, except I remember sitting out on the air deck, watching those Freedom Birds leave, and I just kind of wondered if there would be anything. What was I going home to, and would I ever do anything more important than leading young Marines?
These Freedom Birds, I take it, were the planes back home?
Yeah, the Continental Airlines were taking us home.
Do you feel like you were changed by your experience in Vietnam?
A little bit probably, but no, I don't guess so. Maybe it just helped me come to grips with, hey, I got to do something with my life, and what it's going to be. And as you said, I thought about staying in the Marine Corps at one point. I eschewed that pretty quick.
How then did you get into the notion that you wanted to go to law school? Did you have lawyer mentors?
No, I did not. I guess it's sort of like that, what are you going to do with your life? I thought about, could I be an actor? Or maybe an evangelist preacher, like Jimmy Swaggart, but I couldn't play the piano. I had enough sense to realize that my personality wouldn't fit a lot of things, like a public accountant or something like that. So I guess, and it's like that Shakespeare, As You Like It, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. And in their times, one man will play many parts. Many parts, huh? I'm thinking lawyers. And I'm thinking not lawyers other than a trial lawyer. And I don't mean I knew the word trial lawyer. I meant the Perry Mason type, And that's criminal law. It's what I'm thinking more I am of any other kind of law. I didn't know what it meant by corporate law or anything like that.
So you just defaulted your way into law school?
And well, what happened, I got home, and my dad was retired, and I applied for a couple law schools. I got on wait listed on one, and as I said, I was in a basketball tournament in Birmingham and found my law school, Cumberland, paid them $100. Walked in just to see it. It was a beautiful school down there at Sanford. Paid them $100, and they accepted me, and I got in. I had no clue about.
So you picked your law school based on a basketball tournament?
I found the school riding by it, saw it.
And what year was this?
That was 70, I got out in 73, so I guess that was 70, 71.
And it's fair to say that back then admission to law school was a lot different than it is today.
I'd say a lot easier, although I couldn't get in the schools I wanted to. So I ended up in Cumberland. As I said, when I got back home, I couldn't get in, so my dad came out of retirement, and he bought a big tract of land and started developing, and I was sort of a common laborer, again. And he kind of stayed in the business. So when I got in law school, I was on the GI Bill. I was a referee in basketball, and I had little side jobs under the Marine Corps Reserve, so I was able to sustain myself a little bit.
So you were down in Birmingham. Were you married at the time?
Yes. Still married to Diane, my first wife, but that first year is when we divorced.
So you're in law school, you're divorced, Was your daughter living with you at the time?
No, she was with her mother at that point. I didn't get Nikki until she was still young. Her mother moved to Atlanta and was teaching school there.
And you continued in law school?
And I stayed in law school and met Pat Matthews, who later became my second wife, Pat Fraley. And one of the great stories there is that she had gone to marry Baldwin. And the first time I ever saw her, she was a pretty woman, and kind of reserved. And so, but with my full of bull, you know, attitude, and kind of swept her a little bit off her feet. And she kept me in law school. My first year, my dad had a heart attack, and I was flying home a lot to take care of the business to make sure. And I made a D in contracts, and that put me under the level. And the Dean Weeks, who loved Pat, by the way, Fraley, loved her. He went out to dinner with one night, and she talked him in to keep me in law school.
So she truly did keep you in law school?
She talked him in. He said, maybe you ought to be better as an engineer or something. So I went back to summer school, took 4 courses in summer school, which was a pretty big load, and made 4 B pluses. I'll never forget it. I didn't even look back. I've made good marks ever since.
So
in law school.
After first year, you turned around and finished
I realized
law school.
I was if I was going to waste my time, might as well stay home. And so.
And during that period, you married Pat?
I married her our senior year, married her, and that's how I got to Fayetteville.
Tell me about that.
Her father was a lawyer in Fayetteville. He was a University of Virginia graduate, a Yale graduate, University of Virginia Law School graduate. And the thing I remember most is coming into Fayetteville. You come into Fayetteville from the south, of course, and you come over, and it's sort of off the top of a ridge, and you look across this panorama that was just gorgeous. And I said, Fayetteville. Wherever I heard Fayetteville, Tennessee, and it dawned on me. Troy Williams, we called him Willie, was one of my troops, one of my Marines, who was a machine gunner in my platoon there, in that Civic Action Group. And I said, wow, I'm in Fayetteville, Tennessee, what a small world. Anyway, I started practicing law. When I passed the bar, her daddy, John Van Valkenburg Matthews, said, now, Razor, I don't want you to be disappointed if you only make, $4,000 or $5,000 your first year in practice.
Did you have a salary then?
No. I just hung up a shingle. I said, Mr. Matthews, I made $20,000 while I was in law school a year. I could pick up cans and make more than that. So I'll never forget it. From October, when I passed the bar, until December, I made $32,000. Whoa! Now, there wasn't any young lawyers in town. That's what made a difference. Today, when you go around, you see, it looked like there's so many young lawyers just struggling to get business. It was just me and Fred Womack, the two, All
right, now what year was this?
This was 1973.
And you made how much money the first quarter?
Somewhere between $32,000 and $36,000.
And to bring that in focus, the average lawyer's salary then was maybe $8,000 or $10,000.
I don't know that.
You never had to experience that?
Never. My next full year, I made $76,000. I'm thinking, wow, because my rent was $50. I had a secretary $50 a week.
And Fred I. Womack.
Fred I. Womack was one of the great trial lawyers that we've ever had. He came from the old school with the white suits, and just was a trial lawyer of the first order. Fred died, as you know. In fact, you sent me one of the finest little embroidered things on his eulogy that I did. I appreciated it, always appreciated that. Hanging on my wall, as you know. But Fred was one of those old school, he's an orator. Standing in front, he'd say, Raymond, and he'd call Gus Tevis, and he'd call Willie, and he'd have a nickname for everybody. He loved to travel. He'd stand up, and he'd always talk about the Apostle Paul down the road of Damascus. Caligula couldn't have done any worse than that, my young man. He called me learned counsel. He was just a gentleman of the first order. And if I can tell one quick story about Fred, when he got ill, and this was 10 years ago when he died. You might remember when he died, John. I can't remember the day, but his last case was against me. And he was representing a fellow who was claiming that my preacher's son had backed into him at the post office and caused him serious injury, doing about 2 miles an hour. We had to go to Nashville to take a deposition of the doctor who treated this kid that claimed he'd been damaged. And so I met with the doctor first, and I said, look, this is my great friend who's been a mentor and just a lovely human being. He's very ill. I don't care what you do. I'm going to win this lawsuit. So give him a good deposition if you don't mind. And he did. We tried the case, and Fred was very sick. And the next thing you know, I'm at his counsel table sitting with him, trying to help him remember what he was supposed to ask.
And you were adversaries in this lawsuit?
I was against him. And of course the jury, as I said, I knew I was going to win the case. The jury found against him, and that was his last case.
Let's go back to this income level. I hate to tell you you have been sheltered, but during that period of time, there were good, hard-working lawyers making a third or less of what you were making. How did you make that kind of money?
Well, I don't know that, what they were making.
I know that. I know that because I was contemporary.
Oh.
So I want to ask you, how did you make so much money?
Well,
did you hit big cases then?
Well, I started the General Sessions Court. I never get the first time. Jimmy Thompson was sitting as a judge for old Temp. They called, Templeton was a regular judge. They say I killed him. I don't know if I did or not. But Jimmy, I'm arguing this case, and Jimmy called me up to the bench. He said, Mr. Fraley? I said, yes, sir. He said, you know this is a civil case, don't you? I said, well, he said, you're arguing criminal law. I said, oh, thank you, sir. And I looked at him, I said, Judge, only thing I ask you, a lawyer's supposed to win his first case. Are you going to be able to help me on this one? He said, sit down, and I'll help you. So I finally, it was a nickel-dime case, but I won that. But at General Sessions case, back in the old days, things have changed in the law drastically. More lawyers, for one. But it was easier, for example, a DUI case. You could get reduced to reckless driving. As old Tim said, if your man will get a haircut, I might help you. You know, that sort of stuff. And I had a lot of these nickel-dime cases that I would maybe charge $200 that I charge maybe $3,500 now.
Were you just working hard, high volume at that particular point? Did you have any big cases?
The big cases came. I had a DUI case that I lost, and I was showing out and acting a fool. You're trying to win it, banging on the table, and two old people back in the back saw me, and they thought that meant I was a good lawyer. It didn't matter. I was doing bankruptcy back in those days, by the way. You can make money in bankruptcy. Didn't do much probate. I leave that to you. But they saw me and acted like it, so I got hired in a case. That was my first, I think it was my first $1 million case. It was in Alabama.
Tell us about that case.
It was a case where they weren't, you can't use the word retarded, but that's what they would call back then, bus ran into my boy and his mother and injured him badly, and I sued them. But the first, I can't remember if the Ford Motor Company case came first. One day, a woman came into my office and said she was Victoria Price. Did I know who that meant? I said, well, if you're the Victoria Price I saw on NBC last night, yes, I know who you are, but I thought she was dead. And that case was the Scottsboro case, where I sued NBC with the help of Don Wyatt, who was a local lawyer. NBC filmed Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys. And in the writing of that, Dan T. Carter was the writer who wrote the book, Scottsboro, Tragedy of the American South. And they made a movie of it. And in that movie, they thought that the two women had died that had allegedly been raped in the 30s on a train coming from Chattanooga back to Huntsville, Alabama. Back in those days, they were hoboing. And the story was really about a wonderful judge named Horton out of Decatur, Alabama. A lot of people don't know that story, but it's worth rehashing a little bit. In the 1930s, these two white women were kind of hoboing from Huntsville to Chattanooga looking for mill work. On their way back, a fight erupted between some white boys and 7 black youngsters who were in a gondola. And somebody in a tower in Paint Rock, Alabama saw it and called ahead to Scottsboro, Jackson County, and they dragged the black boys off the bus, and there were these 2 white women in the gondola. And of course, they claimed they had been molested by these black boys. And the case was tried in Scottsboro, and they were, and a drunk lawyer represented them, and they were convicted. Well, they were tried within a week or something. It was ridiculous, and they were all to hang.
And what year was this?
This is in the 30s.
Okay.
At that time, the Communist Party was just in its formative stages in America, and the NAACP was also in the formative stages. And so it became a great contest to see who could represent those young black kids. And a fellow named Leibowitz, who was a famous lawyer in New York, came south to represent him, and he refused to be associated with the Communist Party or the NAACP. Roy Wilkins at that time was big. And he got to change the venue, got it set aside, and it was sent over to Decatur, Alabama, Morgan County, where it was tried in front of Judge Horton, and the jury again convicted. And Judge Horton, to his great credit, set it aside, and he lost his political career as a result of that. And Norris, the last of those black youngsters, finally got out of jail, 10, 15 years ago. All of them are dead now, but it was a case that I had no clue when I brought that lawsuit that it was going to be so famous. I was in every newspaper in America. My mother called me on Mother's Day. She said I was in my front page picture in the Raleigh News and Observer.
What was the theory of your lawsuit?
What happened, these women were still alive, the two women, and they painted them in a bad light to put the good light on Judge Horton. And I sued for defamation, basically. And Don White helped me on that case. And we tried that case and lost. He directed a verdict. Judge Neese, who, by the way, was the same lawyer, a judge who gave me the great decisions in the first Ford Motor Company case I had.
And Judge Neese was where? In
Winchester in the Eastern District. We tried that, lost. I appealed it to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they kept that case for 6 or 7 months, and on a split decision ruled against me as well. I asked for certiorari requested certiorari to the Supreme Court of the United States, and got it. Whoa! They sent me my certificate when I applied and it called me Raymond W. Fraley. And that was going to be my opening argument to him too, by the way, that I wasn't a public figure, but the appellate court had all ruled that, and Judge Neese that my lady was a public figure. I said, judges, she's been out of circulation for 50 years. Nothing. 40
Did you
years.
argue the case in the U.S. Supreme Court?
They settled the case, not literally on the courthouse steps, but they settled it before I could argue. I can't remember if it would have been Sandra Day O'Connor's first case or not. I wish I could remember that. I want to believe it was going to be her first.
Were you ready to argue in the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
How did you get ready for that? How did you prepare?
Back in those days, today I have all this trepidation about lawsuits. Back in those days, it was all bravado. I can handle it.
So did you have assistants, co-counsel going?
Yeah, Don White.
Don White, another Fayetteville lawyer, were going to Washington, D.C. before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah. And when they offered the money, I didn't think it was enough. But my client, bless her heart, Victoria, she was old and worn out. And she had a little squirrely husband, just a cute little fellow. And she just said, I want to own a home. I've never owned a home. And I want my husband to have a...
How old was she at the time?
She must have been 60-something.
And how old were you?
I was 30-something, 30.
Can you disclose the amount of the settlement?
I can't. It wasn't as much as it should have been, but she got a new home. She wanted her husband to have a new truck. She got that and some other things that she wanted.
Did you make a good fee?
I did.
Did you get paid for all the time and worry?
No, I didn't. No, but what it did for me, it put me in the national news. I tried a murder case up in Chicago. I had a fraud case in St. Petersburg, Florida. I had an airplane back in those days.
Still under 40 years of age.
I was pushing 40 then, but I got that case I tell you, that crazy woman called me. That's where she saw it in the paper, and I got a case against Major League Baseball. I represented an umpire, and Melvin Belli, who was then the king of torts, they called him back in the day, called me, and I spoke to 3,000 lawyers in Toronto. I think he was trying to pipe my case. And by the way, after that case, when I went to Toronto, I didn't win it. As it turned out, I didn't have, the law was against me, but Joe Graziolo Jr., Joe Garagiola being one of the great catchers and broadcasters in baseball. Son had the case to start with. So as a result of that Scottsboro case, I got the Ford Motor Company, my first Ford Motor Company gas tank explosion case.
Right, let's hold that one just for a second. I want to go back to Ford, but let me ask you a couple of questions. Did you have your own airplane then?
Yeah.
Did you fly commercial to these long distance places, or?
I flew. No, I had a Cessna.
Were you your own pilot?
No, I had one of my law school buddies in Auburn, Alabama. We bought a hotel down there together, motel, and he said we need an airplane. So he was a construction guy working all over. And
when you fly commercial, did you fly to Nashville or Huntsville or where?
both. If I go to
it?
Raleigh, I like to go to Nashville when I go to Chapel Hill, so it's quicker one way.
And how far is it from Fayetteville to Nashville Airport?
It's 80, almost 90 miles.
So that was generally your jump-off point.
Yeah.
Okay, now before we go back to Ford, you've done some criminal work as well over the years, haven't you?
I've tried at least 14 homicide cases. I was thinking about that for this interview, about how many homicide cases have I had. At least 14, I can count 14 for sure. And there are some of the interesting cases I've
Were
ever
you
had.
paid well?
Yeah. When I say paid well, yes, I was paid not as well as I would say if you hit $1 million case or something, but yeah, I was paid pretty well.
Were you successful?
I was.
What does that mean?
Well, I got some acquittals. I had cases where I had one, his name was Disco Dave. The murder took place at the Ku Klux Klan in Giles County, Ku Klux Klan Induction Center at a place called the Broken Spokes. During that day, a motorcycle washing had taken place, and they must have washed 140 motorcycles. And these weren't your Sunday riders. These were, my Lord, the sociopaths, psychopaths. It was incredible. Jim T. Hamilton tried that case. I'll never forget it. The DA moved to mistry the case on my opening statement.
And why was that?
I had learned to do some technology, and I'd thrown up some stuff on the board that he claimed that we haven't seen any of this. I said, you gave it to me in discovery. No, I didn't, and I had to show it to him, and so that case went well for old Disco.
And Judge Jim T. Hamilton was where?
He's out of Columbia. Originally, he was from. He was the lawyer for Buford Pusser. And I love Jim T. He was one of the great clowns of all, great judges of all time. Fun to be around. I mean,
any of your criminal clients go to the state penitentiary?
Oh yeah. Unfortunately, I represented back-to-back 2 blondes that had murdered their husbands, and one of them went well, all right. She didn't get crushed, but the other one did. I guess when you shoot your husband in the face with a shotgun, it's a little tough to defend it. But
without disclosing any confidential information, do you have any clients that you really feel like were innocent and were sent to jail?
I guess the most emotional case I ever had was State versus Jacob Davis. It was a schoolyard killing, school ground killing, that was televised nationally live. Rich McGee came to me and helped me with that case. I couldn't have done it without him, out of Nashville. And we tried that case on live TV. I was critiqued every day. They had these 2 women that came down with court TV, and we had dinner with them every night, and they critiqued me, and they were cold-blooded, these 2 women, and they were, but I don't know that, it don't mean that he was innocent, but I just thought, first of all, it was a capital case. I had to save his life, first of all, so he won that issue. And then the next was, can he get parole if he's convicted? Because they were going to try the state wanted life without parole. It was just one of those tragic things of a young man who had a scholarship going to Mississippi State, fell in love. Another fellow loved her too. You know, the same old story. Frankie and Johnny were sweethearts. And so that, I remember calling my mother, and hadn't cried in a long time. And
is he still in jail?
He's still in jail. I wish he's doing nice things too in jail, by the way. He still is in jail. Whew. That was
You tried a case in Chicago. First place, how did you get the case?
That because of that Scottsboro case. I got a call from somebody, and I never cooked it. I took my now wife. She had recently graduated from the University of Alabama. She was 21 years old. I was 34. I took her up there with me, and my client picked me up in a pimp mobile. She'll never had fur all over it, and she was scared to death. Dropped me off at the old Blackstone Hotel before it went to seed. And here's the great story about luck and life, and how my life has always been, the word for me has always been kismet. Just somehow it falls in place. Well, I go up there the first time, and there you can strike up to 50 judges. They have up to 3 judges. They have 50 felony judges in Cook County then. 50 felony judges. And you can strike up to 3. Well, I looked at the panel and saw there was a black judge from Virginia. I thought, well, heck, that's me, baby. I can make some hay here. Well, first thing he does to me, he says, are you licensed to practice law in this state, Mr. Fraley? I said, no, sir, I'm not licensed, but I can handle the case. I know the rules up here. He said, not in my court. Well, it's getting close to lunchtime, and this fella comes up to me, and he speaks to me. He said, look, say you'll come back after lunch with somebody. I said, what do you mean? He said, just tell him. I said, Judge, I'll be back after lunch and have somebody introduce me to the court. Go pro hac vice. Well, the fella, I walk out with him. He's Brent Musburger. Todd Musburger, Brent Musburger's brother, being the great commentator, sports commentator. So he takes me to lunch, and we had a Polish sausage and 2 beers. Went back, and he introduced me and said he'll sit second chair with me so I could do this case. Well, I had to come back up for motions another time, and it was getting worse because now the judge he doesn't like me. I'm thinking, this is awful. So I go back to the airport. I'm by myself. I'm sitting there reading the Thornbirds, and I miss my dadgum airplane. Oh, I am sick. So I go up to the restaurant. They have a thing called the 7 Continental Restaurants, and they have seats that go around one person against the wall. I sit down, and beside a beautiful black woman. I mean, this girl was absolutely dynamite. And I spoke to her, and I looked over, and I said, what are you having? She said, a lentil. I said, you don't look Jewish. She said, I'm not. And so I ordered some sangria for us, and we drank a little bit. She said, what are you doing here? I asked her what she was doing, and she was engaged at that time to the mayor of Cleveland. I still have his card and her card and one of my old wallets. And she got around. She said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just a jackleg lawyer from Tennessee, and I was up here and to try this, to get this essay ready, and I feel like I've been, kind of mistreated up here. And he said, well, and so I told her who the judge was. I can't remember the judge's name, but she said, Uncle Willie? Just like that. 15 million people around there, and I'm sitting with the judge's niece, and she had just left about the same time I left the courthouse in Cook County. Make a long story short, I tried that thing non-jury, time served, and he had cut the girl's throat. So it was sweet. That was one of the great, just sitting in the airport.
Kismet. You had a case over here either in Bedford or Lincoln County that you fought the other lawyer over a pistol. Tell us about that. Ron
Wilson was a fine trial lawyer here, and he was a cold-blooded lawyer from Bedford here in your county, and he prosecuted specially. He was a good lawyer in other things, but he could prosecute, just be hired for that particular case. And my client was named Herman Balcom. I had been against him in a divorce case with his wife, who later named her child after me, by the way. But I got called to the jail, and Herman had killed a woman down at his farm, and he said, I want you to treat everybody just like he treated me in that divorce case. I said, well, tell me the facts, and he did. He shot the girl in the face with a pistol. So we went to trial, and Ron Wilson specially prosecuted, and he was trying to introduce the pistol, and I was objecting, and Bobby Parks, who was a judge at that time, Bobby was you knew Bobby well as I did, John T. But anyway, he wasn't paying much attention, so I jumped up, grabbed Ron's wrist, and we fell into the jury box with the pistol, unloaded, of course. But before that trial started, Jim Kidd, who had been around as a DA for a long time, I took an old rusted hatchet and put it on my counsel table. And Jim saw that and thought it had something to do with the case. It had nothing to do with it. But it threw him off kilter, and he sent his investigator out to the farm to see if he could put together what that hatchet had to do with it in that case. And Ron was so cold-blooded as a prosecutor. When he finished and the jury went out, he just went home. He didn't stay for the jury verdict.
So did you fight over the pistol?
No, we didn't fight over it. I grabbed his wrist and we tumbled into the jury box.
Now, you say this kismet or this luck, and you have certainly had your fair share of that.
I have.
But surely there was a little bit more to your career. Do you work hard?
Well, I go to work I used to go to work every morning at 5, and now I go to work at 7 to 6. But I ride the bicycle at lunchtime, so I get an hour and a half.
Even during trials?
No, I can't do it during trials most of the time.
But your daily routine, you're riding a bicycle at lunch?
Yeah. Every day, except the day.
Do you feel like you prepare for your cases, each case, pretty thoroughly?
I'm better now than ever in preparation because of people like Olin Haynes, C.J. Gideon, Rich McGee. Preparation. And the law has changed so much that you just can't. Bob Peters was the best lawyer I ever saw without really having to prepare. He had a brilliant
Tell
mind.
us who Bob Peters is.
Bob's a lawyer over in Winchester, Tennessee, who has a PhD. His daughter is, by the way, is a phenomenal scientist with a PhD and a medical degree. He just has one of those minds that are just mind-boggling. And he could try a lawsuit basically without, he doesn't do much voir dire. Tremendous writer.
When you went to Chicago, did you play the country lawyer up or down?
No, I didn't play it up down. I played it as a Virginia Cavalier for this Virginian, but I guess that insulted him. He was from Petersburg. No, I didn't. I didn't play down home.
Let's talk about the Ford cases. Where did that fall in your career, and how many did you have?
I've had 4 against Ford Motor Company. The first one had to do with the McKinn family. It was a tragic thing. They were in a Maverick, and they were rear-ended by an 80-mile-an-hour vehicle. Again, kismet. At the time I got that case, and frankly, I wasn't really qualified for it.
How old were you?
I was very the same age, because of that Scottsboro case. But the thing that struck me about that case, and Bob Peters helped me on that case, by the way. Bob joined me on that case. The 2 little girls were killed. Mother's arm was literally burned off, and the father was just horribly scarred from the burns. And the theory was, from Ford, was that no vehicle could have withstood the impact of an 80-mile-an-hour vehicle. Although Ford had crash tests that which showed that it would be, 30 miles an hour would ignite it. Now you have to remember, these gas tank location in these Ford Mavericks and Ford Pintos, and even in their flagship car, were located like a suitcase in the back with very little firewall. So when it was hit, it would explode that gas tank through the compartment, and that's what happened. Judge Neese, the same judge who ruled against me in the Scottsboro case, had a statement. I can't remember. I want to say it was something like, Ford Motor Company at that time was settling those cases, then boxing up the files, and we couldn't get to crash tests. So there was a lawyer named Foy Devine and Brother Hare in Birmingham, Foy Devine in Atlanta, and Mark Robinson in Los Angeles, California. Mark had the largest jury verdict in the history of the United States, but he tried it like 6 months to get to the jury, and he got like $500 million on a Ford case. And he had several of these cases going at that time. Well, Judge, I moved to get my crash test, and the judge, they wouldn't give it to me. The judge said, give Fraley the crash test or let the hammer fall. Oh, so I end up going to Dearborn, Michigan, to get the crash test, and it took
me. Was Peters with you, Bob Peters with you?
He wasn't with me on that particular day to see if I could decipher the crash tests. They were almost in code. I spent 8 hours lost. So I go back. Bob and I talk about it, and I non-sued it because Ford Motor Company had been indicted criminally, And that's when the news hit. NBC, ABC, 60 Minutes, everything was doing it. They were after Ford Motor Company. And I'm thinking, let's see what happens. This might be the ticket. So Ford Motor, Jim Neal represented them out of Nashville. Well, I can't remember what happened to the case, but anyway, I got free publicity in my case. So I go back, refile, I go back there, and I'm taking depositions, and I walk out. I'm going to get to the Ford.
Where are you taking?
I'm in
depositions?
Dearborn at the Hyatt Regency. They're taking depositions of their engineers, and I walk out at the first day, and I run into Mark Robinson, who had just gotten that big verdict, and we became friends, great friends after.
He was a lawyer from where?
Lawyer from Los Angeles. Brother was a lawyer. Other brother was a football coach at that time in North Carolina State, and his daddy was a famous jurist. Lived right beside one of the famous movie stars in Bel Air there, where he lived. I stayed there. So I walked out, met, and they introduced me to the court reporter did, a little girl named Kirk, K-I-R-K. And so I had dinner with him that night. And he said, what kind of case you got? And I told him, he said, you got a heck of a case. I said, yeah, I think so too, but I'm kind of out of my element. You know.
Were you by yourself?
No, Peters was with me at that
Okay.
point. So I said, let's have breakfast tomorrow morning. I want to talk to you about something. So I said, Bob, why don't we associate him? He's with the big boys. He can go up and talk to Henry Ford II if he wants to, probably. Maybe get this thing settled. We were about 9 weeks out of the trial. And so the next morning, we talked to him, and I said, look, how much would it take to get you boys involved in my case? And he said, well, we'd have to have 12%. I said, 12% for all I want you to do is take a race car driver's, NASCAR driver's deposition in San Diego and one other, and maybe meet with, you know, the big boys to see if you can get this thing settled. I'm just a peon to them. He says, well, no, we want 12%. So I looked at Bob, and we went back in to finish the depositions that day, and I'll come back to the deposition in a minute. But came back that night, had dinner again. I said, Mark, you got your brother Jeff here, who was a football player at the University of Pacific University, and you played at Stanford football. And the other brother's coach. I said, you play basketball? He said, yeah, I play basketball. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. We'll meet you at the YMCA tomorrow after depositions, and we'll play 2-on-2 basketball, me and Peters here. And 2 out of 3, winner, make it, take it, which means you score, you get the ball back. And if we win, we get you for 8%. If we lose, I'll give you 15%. Because I figured zero is nothing. So the next.
Peters is quite athletic, isn't he?
No, he's terrible. Jeez. So he's in his hush puppies. I'm decked out in my, my Jordans and stuff. And so we teed it up, and his brother's 6'2", and Mark's my size, and it was a bloodbath. Peters took a hook shot from the top of the key, and I jumped on his butt, and I said, Peters, set the picks, give me the ball, and we'll get him for 8%. And sure enough, we got him 8%, and 2 years later, I'm at the California Trial Lawyers Association, speaking to the group, tips from a country lawyer, how I fleeced.
So you did
Mark
play
Robinson.
that. You did play that.
We played it hard, and he, man of his word, 8%.
Did you settle the case?
And got it settled. It got close, but we got it settled because of Mark. Now, could we have won the case trying it? I think so, because Bob was so smart, brilliant. He just was. He just was smart. When I took the deposition, by the way, we had gotten in this some of the discovery 2 office memos that were signed off by Henry Ford II. One of them referred to the burn victims as Crispies. The other one said that it would be cheaper to pay the burn victims $250,000 per case than to change the configuration of the gas tank location. Awful. I said, you, sir, are killing people. No, he said, when I handed it to him, they said, you're an os. I said, you, sir, are killing people. And but I didn't get to play that at the trial because we settled it, but that was the first one.
Can you disclose the amount of the settlement?
It was my first multi-million-dollar case.
And have you had other multi-million-dollar cases?
Yes.
Rattle them off real quickly.
Well, I had one in your county here.
What kind of case?
It was C.J. Gideon and I tried that case.
By the way, how do you know which lawyers to pick for which cases? You pick them, right?
Well, I must be somewhat candid when I say the smartest thing I've ever learned is when you're by yourself in a small town and with the volume I have, I might do 20 DUIs a month. you can't handle it all. When these big cases come in, I never get the Ford Motor Company case. Before we got that thing settled, I had $120,000 of my own money in that case. Well, the bank's money, I got a letter of credit that I didn't have. So you can imagine it's, so over the years I've learned to always find somebody that's smarter than I am, that maybe has an expertise in a particular field. And Olin Haynes is one. We've done, one of my cases with him was the pharmacy case, and we got $4.6 million thereabouts. And but C.J. Gideon, I met C.J. C.J. was hired by Liberty Mutual when he was with McGugan to come to Fayetteville. They had this hotshot lawyer down there that's killing us in these work comp cases. Back in those days, I was the only one doing work comp cases, which was incredible because it was a cash cow, just a cash cow. Didn't have to prove liability, just got to know the formulas, and nobody seemed to want to do that. And so they sent him down, C.J. Gideon from Nashville, to go against me. And I saw real quick that he knew medicine like you wouldn't believe. He just knew medicine. I was astounded. So finally, one day after one of our cases we tried, he didn't win any of the cases necessarily, but he would keep it down for fear they won't appeal it. And he would appeal it. And so we had dinner one night at my house. I was single back then. And I said, "What are you doing, wasting your time?" Oh, back in those days, CJ had blonde hair, and he was a dashing-looking fellow from Duke University and Vanderbilt Law. And so we had our first medical malpractice case together in Huntsville, Alabama, about 40 years ago, about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, in Huntsville, Alabama, against an orthopedic surgeon. And then he started his own firm. And since then, we've had, without question, well over $20 to $30 million in verdicts and settlements in nursing home cases, primarily because he represents doctors as a defense lawyer. And then Olin and I take on the malpractice cases. And that's how it's gone.
What about, do you have any other big cases that have a special place in your memory?
You have to, can you jog my memory on that?
You've had several nursing home cases.
Yes.
In various counties around here, Bedford, Marshall, Franklin.
The interesting one in Franklin County that CJ and I tried, it was interesting because the fellow had died and he lost about 45 pounds in a very short period of time. The problem is the other lawyer from Nashville, from Chattanooga, whose name was Alvin York. Alvin York, I can't remember his last name, but his first two names were Alvin York, you know, the famous World War I. And they being in the hospital, when they weighed my man, they had him weighed in one of those slings in a wheelchair. So when they took him out of it, obviously his weight, and he never picked up on that. And so that was a nice case there that we hit a big lick. And then we hit one in Giles County. Tried that. The jury came back on my daughter's birthday. I'll never forget that one in Giles. That was a nursing home case. That was actually a malpractice, but it was a ER doctor. Some of my best successes have been ER doctors.
If you had to pick a case of your dreams, the last case you would try, what type of case would you prefer to be trying?
Probably a criminal case. And the reason for it is I think it makes me feel like a real lawyer when you're protecting somebody's liberty. You know what?
What if they're guilty?
They still have a right to representation. And
what about those poor victims and you're outlawing the state? How do you feel about that?
Say that again?
You say everybody has a right to be protected. What about those poor victims that you just happen to outlawyer the state's attorney who's been out of law school 2 years? Do you have any remorse?
I can respond to that I do not take, just can't take a serious child abuse case. Now, let me tell you what I do in those cases. If somebody comes to me, a mother or something, and says her son didn't do it, I'll have a preliminary hearing. And when I have that preliminary hearing, I learn pretty quick whether my clients lied to me and told me not the truth, and I can say I'm not going to take the case at the next level. And I usually price myself away from that. But one of my favorite cases that I tried in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, was where I used a circadian rhythms expert out of Harvard. He was an Englishman, And it was a case in which my nurse client, who drove 50 miles one way to work every day to Columbia from Loretto, Tennessee in Lawrence County, she worked at shifts, night shift from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock next morning. And the doctors had a little breakfast that morning. And before she went home, she was out of her sleep rhythms. She had one mimosa, and 5 miles from home, after driving 48, she ran over a man in a tractor and killed him. State troopers didn't think she was under the influence, so they didn't test her. But the DA, whose granddaughter was on his staff of the victim, prosecuted that case to the hilt. In fact, it was, and we tried that case hard. And I brought this circadian rhythms expert in. He was a Harvard man, English, who was a cardiologist as well. And he walked in that courtroom and they demanded to take his briefcase. He thought he was he didn't know where he was in the Deep South. But that case was important to me because I knew this woman didn't need to be in the penitentiary.
Did you win?
I won.
Was you think primarily because of your expert out of Harvard?
That expert and one who talked about that one mimosa would not cause her to be impaired.
All right, I want to ask you a few things about the changing practice, but let's take a break right here.